Hello everyone, welcome to Global Compliance Panel live webinar on outsourced processes and ISO 9001-2008. My name is Ron and I'm going to be a host for today's session. On behalf of the Global Compliance Panel team, I'd like to thank you all for being part of this event. Today's webinar will be presented by Dan O'Leary. A few words about Dan before we could start off today's session. Dan is the president of Ombu Enterprises LLC, a company offering training and execution in operational excellence, focused on analytic skills and a systems approach to operations management. Dan has more than 30 years experience in quality, operations, and program management in regulated industries, including aviation, defense, medical devices, and clinical labs. He has a master's degree in mathematics, is an ASQ certified biomedical auditor, quality engineer, reliability engineer, and Six Sigma black belt, and is certified by APICS in resource management. We are honored to have Dan with us to present today's webinar. Now, ladies and gentlemen, before we begin, I would like to inform you of the program outline for this training session. This webinar is for 75 minutes duration. First, Dan will take you through today's webinar, highlighting the areas that he will be covering, and he will then share with you his presentation. I would also like to inform all participants, once you're part of this teleconference, you will be placed on mute, and you will remain so until the Q&A begins towards the end of the webinar. Now, this is just for the purpose of avoiding discontinuity and for allowing our speaker to speak clearly so that everyone present can take maximum benefit. I would also request all to hold back your questions until the Q&A window begins. 10 minutes of your time will be allotted for the Q&A, during which your questions will be answered. Now, if for any reason you get logged out of this training session or teleconference, please follow the same procedure to join in again. And now that we're all ready to start, I request Dan to take it from here. Dan?
Thank you, Ron, and welcome everybody to our webinar on outsourced processes and ISO 9001. Now, as Ron mentioned, we're going to have a Q&A session at the end, and most of the slides have a slide number on the bottom, and so you should, if you have a question about a particular slide, note the slide number, and we can go back and look at it in the context of your question. So here's the outline of what we're going to talk about today. We're going to look at a short history of ISO 9001-2008. In particular, we're interested in the changes from the 2000 edition because this is where outsourced processes started to show up. So we're going to look at how that came to be. And then we're going to look at the requirements for outsourced processes. They show up in Clause 4.1. And so we're going to talk about what the clause is telling us. We're going to define a process. We're going to understand what an outsourced process is. And there's an ISO guidance document that's going to help you. And so we're going to talk about what's in that ISO guidance document as well. Now, outsourced processes are going to be purchased. So we're going to have to talk about purchasing. So we're going to look at some of the purchasing controls in Clause 7.4, requirements, evaluation, selection, supplier agreements, and so on. One of the things that we need to do in terms of processes in ISO 9001 is monitor and measure the processes so we understand how they're operating. And this also applies to outsourced processes. And the difficulty, of course, is that outsourced processes are happening in a different company. So that often leads us into supplier scorecards. So now we're going to be interested in looking at supplier scorecards as part of the monitoring and measuring of processes. Then we'll do summary and conclusions and open it up for questions. All right, so here's ISO 9001. I'm going to give you a very brief history because it's worth understanding a little bit about how it got to be in the shape that it's in today. And in particular, as I mentioned, the changes from the 2000 edition where this first starts to show up. So ISO is the International Organization for Standardization. It originated in 1947, and it has a large number of member countries with a headquarters in Geneva, Switzerland. And they are responsible for publishing international standards. And they do that. And they publish a large number of other documents as well. So beyond the standards that we're usually familiar with, they do technical reports. So oftentimes you'll see them as ISO/TR or technical specifications, guides. There's a guide, ISO guides available in laboratory work and so on. So they publish not only a tremendously large number of international standards, but a variety of other documents as well. But we're going to be interested in just one of the standards. So there are about 17,000, 18,000 standards that are published by ISO so far, and they publish about 1,000 new standards every year. So it's quite a busy organization. In order to do this, it's organized into technical committees and subcommittees. And so technical committees are going to have membership from the ISO member organizations from around the world. And so there are U.S. representatives, for example, on TC 176, which is Quality Management and Quality Assurance. And that's the technical committee that's responsible for ISO 9001, for the whole ISO 9000 family, actually. And that technical committee is then organized into subcommittees. So there's one on concepts and terminology, there's one on quality systems, and one on supporting technologies. And so the standards are often going to come from the work of the subcommittees, and then they'll go through the whole committee, and then they go through a voting process for ISO members before they finally get published. And that's what's going on here. Now, we're interested in the ISO 9000 family. And there's also always a little bit of confusion about ISO 9000 because it really means two different things. It is the name of a standard, and so we're going to talk a little bit about what that standard is. And it also turns out to be the name of a whole family of standards. So in the ISO 9000 family, we've got ISO 9000 itself, which is fundamentals and vocabulary. We'll talk about that. ISO 9001, which is requirements, and ISO 9004, which is how to manage a quality management system. And so those are some of the principal members of the ISO 9000 family, and there's a lot more. There's a series of documents that are numbered in the 10,000s. So there's one on how to write documentation, one on applying statistical techniques, one on developing quality manuals, one on measuring customer satisfaction. So there's a variety of things in the family. Now, we're going to primarily talk about two in particular, ISO 9001, which is going to be our primary focus. And the other one of great importance is ISO 9000. Its fundamentals and vocabulary. The beginning part is fundamentals, and it tells you the principles of quality management systems and how they relate to each other, and then how they end up being implemented in ISO 9001. But more important, in my opinion, is the vocabulary. So if you ever wanted to understand what defined terms are, this is where the language is. So if you have ever wondered what the difference is between corrective action and preventive action, for example, it's defined in ISO 9000. If you ever were curious about the difference between rework and repair, those are defined terms in ISO 9000. So it's a normative reference to ISO 9001, so you need to get a copy of it. And it'll solve a lot of problems because that's the vocabulary. That's where the terms are defined and that are used in ISO 9001. Now, it's evolved over time, and we're going to actually start with the ISO 1987 versions. There were 5 standards in this immediate family, and I've listed them here. And one of the things that's changed over time is at at this level, there were actually 3 standards that were being applied: 9001, 9002, and 9003. And the idea here is that they contain quality elements. And so there were, in ISO 9001, 20 quality elements, for example. And this was a standard that you, as the customer, applied to your manufacturer, to your supplier. So the idea was that you, as the consumer of stuff from the supplier, would tell the supplier you're going to implement an ISO 9001, 9002, or 9003 quality management system. So that was that changed, and that's going to lead us into where we are today. And what you'll notice is that these were sort of tiered models. So if your supplier was doing design, development, production, installation, or servicing, then 9001 is what you would do. If they were doing production, installation, or servicing, it's 9002. If they were only doing some kind of final inspection and test, or maybe they were just a distributor, then it was 9003. So you had to pick the appropriate standard, and then it became something that you imposed in a contract on your supplier. And that's how you managed what the supplier was doing. Now, they varied in complexity, and so you can see the little summary here of what I've just talked about. Now, you as the customer are going to invoke the appropriate standard, and then the idea is that your supplier is going to register the quality management system with a notified body or some kind of approval authority. And then you as the customer don't have to do quality management systems on your supplier because they've hired somebody, a third party, to do it for you. And they're going to present you with their certificates and their audit reports and all of that sort of stuff. So that was the concept from the 1987 model, some of which is still in effect today, some of which has changed. Now, that took us to the 1994 versions. And there the standards were updated. They retain the same basic approach, however, in that there were 3 standards that were being applied to suppliers depending upon the level of activity that the supplier was doing for you as the customer. So you impose these on your supplier. Now, 2000 came along, the 2000 version, and all of that changed. So then we developed this process approach. So rather than a set of quality elements, there were 20 elements in ISO 9001, for example, the idea was now to put all of this stuff into processes and write the standard around processes. And ISO 9001, 2, and 3 were all consolidated into one document, ISO 9001. And the idea there was that you would tailor your approach to your quality management system. And again, the point of view changed because now this was a quality management system that a company applied to itself, rather than in the old versions where you as the customer told your supplier what quality management system you had to have. The point of view changes, and so now you have a quality management system that you're going to impose upon yourself, and then you're going to have it a third party come in and say that you've properly implemented it, and then you get a certificate to put on the wall, and now you can tell all of your customers. So your customers aren't necessarily imposing this, and so this is the model in the 2000 version. So this was a major change. Now the process approach comes from this application of the system of processes inside an organization, together with identification and interaction of the processes. So the idea here is that management is going to manage processes and their interrelationships and how they transfer material, information, data, all of that sort of stuff between the processes. So you as the manufacturer, or you as the ISO 9000 company, 9001 company in this case, are going to define all of your processes, how they interact with each other, what their relationships are. And when you do that, you are adopting the process approach. And the idea here is that in the process approach, you're going to link all of these requirements in clauses 4.8 through this process improvement methodology. And it basically picks up a classic plan, do, check, act methodology. This has been very popular as a quality tool for a number of years. It's got a number of names, the Schuhart approach, the Deming wheel, and so on. But it's been around for a long time, and this is how you now are going to continuously improve the process approach that you've applied to your company. Now, 2008 comes along, and ISO issued a new version, and the differences between the 2000 version and the 2008 version are explained in a table in the back of the standard. Now, the idea at this time was that the changes from 2000 to 2008 were not going to be significant changes. They were going to make some small adjustments and some minor improvements and fix some problems, because the next version of the standard was going to have major changes. Now, it's been published as a draft. We expect it will come out in 2015. So the draft is available, and the standard we think is going to be published in 2015, and then there'll probably be a one-year transition period. And it restructures everything. Changes the numbering system, does a variety of things. And so because we only have the draft, we're not going to talk about it in this presentation, but it's something you need to think about for the future. All right, so now the idea here is that we've switched the point of view from the element approach to the process approach. And that happened in the 2000 version. In the 2008 version, there was the realization that processes happen in two different places. There are some processes in the quality management system that happen at the company. There are some processes required in the quality management system that happen at a supplier site. And so that's basically what the difference is the recognition that in the 2008 version, where they were just making minor adjustments, they needed to account for the fact that not all of the processes required for the quality management system are internal processes. So that's where we are today. Now, we need some definitions. And this is very important. And you'll notice that the definitions are in ISO 9000-2005. This is the vocabulary document that I mentioned before. And so this is very important that you get a copy of this document, because it's where all of these terms are defined. And so you need it to have an effective quality management system. So what are we talking about here? Well, a process is a set of interrelated or interacting activities that transforms inputs into outputs. So my process is going to take something in, it's going to transform it in some way, and it's going to give something out. And so that's the definition of a process. And if you ever looked at some of the Six Sigma things, there's a technique called the SIPOC diagram, which is supplier, input, process, output, and customer. And what it does is show the relationship, right? So the inputs are the inputs to the process. The outputs are the outputs from the process. The process is the transformation process. And then in the SIPOC diagram, we've got the supplier who provides the inputs and the customer who consumes the outputs. And the outputs of a process are called the product. Right? So a product is the result of a process. So the process is going to produce products. And it's really important to recognize that that products is a very broad term. So the note here tells us that there are four generic kinds of products. There are services, there are software, there's hardware, and there's process material. Now, Services, maybe it's a transportation service. Software could be development of an app. Hardware could be the development of a physical piece of thing that you buy. Process material could be oil or petroleum products or things like that. So those are all produced by processes, and processes could have, as we've seen here, there can be processes in the quality management system that produce hardware, software, services, and so on. So these processes and products are going to be very important. Now, Clause 4.1 added a note. And so what they were trying to do is not necessarily make major changes to the standard. They were just fiddling these things. And one of the problems that they recognized is that this idea that processes could happen in two places. So rather than changing ISO 9000 and the major portion of 9001, they added some things in notes to Clause 4.1. And here's where we find what is essentially a definition. An outsourced process is a process the organization needs for its quality management system, and the organization chooses to have it performed by an external party. Now, this is the recognition that in the process approach, the process could happen in one of two places. It could happen inside the organization, or it could happen outside the organization. And so an outsourced process is where the process happens outside your organization by your choice. So it's part of your quality management system, but somebody else is doing it for you. And so this underlined portions are what got added in the 2008 version. So this is essentially the definition of an outsourced process. Now, ISO 9000 in the fundamentals portion talks about evaluating a quality management system. And it says that there are basically 4 questions to ask as you're looking at this in relationship to processes and their evaluation. Is the process identified and appropriately defined? Are the responsibilities assigned? Are there procedures implemented and maintained? And is the process effective in achieving its required results? Well, this concept of processes and their evaluation applies whether the process is an internal process or an outsourced process. And so this is going to be the framework that we're going to use to develop some of the things to look for in terms of outsourced processes. Now, here's the requirements that we need to talk about. When an organization, it says, chooses to outsource any process that affects product conformity to requirements, the organization shall ensure control over such processes. So that was the portion that was in the original 2000 version of ISO 9001. And then is this addition. The type and extent of control is going to be defined within the quality management system. So what this means is if you are having an outsourced process performed by an external organization, then that process is happening someplace else. What you have to define inside your quality management system is how you're going to control it. Right? The type and extent of control of that outsourced process is documented inside your quality management system. Process happens externally. The requirements for type and extent of control are documented internally. Now, the other new thing in Note 3 is this idea that you control these outsourced processes. They are part of your organization, and so consequently, you're responsible for everything that happens. So you, as the ISO 9001 company, have the responsibility for conformity to all customer, statutory, and regulatory requirements. And you're going to do that by defining the type and extent of control of these outsourced processes. And here's a couple of things that you want to think about. The potential impact of the outsourced process on your capability. Right? So you need to think about how this outsourced process is going to affect you. In some sense, this is a kind of risk management approach. the degree to which the control of the process is shared. Now, there may be things going on in the external process over which you have a high level of control, or maybe you're providing material that's being transformed in the external process, and you have control over the material. So you're going to have to figure out how much of control is being shared between the two parties. And then the capability of achieving the necessary control through application of purchasing. So remember, this outsourced process is happening at an external organization. In essence, this is purchasing. You are having a relationship with an external supplier, and so all of the purchasing controls should be applying as well. Now, this is a view of how all of this is going to fit together. So we have a process plan, and so we're going to determine the processes in our quality management system. Having identified these processes, then we're going to figure out the order in which they happen and how they interact with each other. So in essence, we're going to have the major list of processes in our quality management system, and then all the inputs and outputs, how they hook up together. And then in order to make sure that they work correctly, we're going to monitor, measure, and analyze those processes. So that's going to be very important. And one of the questions that you have to ask is who performs the process? Which ones are internal to your organization, that is a process performed by an internal party, and which ones are outsourced, that is processes performed by an external party. So in essence, you're going to develop a process plan that's going to identify all of your processes, their interrelationships, how you'd monitor and measure them, and also where they happen, internal or external, that is outsourced process. Now, guidance documents are not well known, I find. And so ISO has issued a whole bunch of guidance documents that are going to help you do the implementation of ISO 9001, essentially. And so these guidance documents are on the ISO website, and I've given you a link that'll get you there. And you can download them at no charge. So unlike the standards, which you have to buy, the guidance documents you can download from the ISO website at no charge, and they are very valuable. And we're going to look at what's going on with WOUN. So here's a list of some of the guidance documents that are available. Now, the one we're going to talk about, I put on the top on outsourced processes. The other one, the next one down, is frequently used words. Oftentimes, there's vocabulary that's not specialized quality vocabulary that shows up in the standards. And so ISO said, well, we should tell you what we mean by those words as well. So that's very interesting. So you really need, it's useful to have this guidance document as well. There's a guidance document on the process approach. There's one on how to implement ISO 9001, 2008. You can tailor ISO 9001, 2008. And it explains how to do it in clause 1.2 of the standard. And here's a guidance document that's going to give you a lot of good ideas about how to tailor things, how to leave things out, and how to document your decisions. And then you have to have documentation. And so there's another guidance document on how to do that. But we're going to be interested in the guidance document on outsourced processes. So an outsourced process can be performed by a supplier that's totally independent of your organization or is part of the same parent, and this becomes very important. So it could be a separate department or division that's not in your quality management system. So the dividing line is really the dividing line of your quality management system in some sense. And there's a couple of rules of thumb that are going to help you figure that out. But one of the things that is very valuable is where do you perform internal quality audits? Now, you're not going to do internal quality audits at a supplier site, right? So that's going to be one of the indications that the process is an outsourced process, right? So this is not an absolute hard and fast rule, but if you've got a sister division, you're probably not going to do internal quality audits at your sister division. If you do audits at all, you're going to think of them as outside audits in some sense, not internal quality audits. So this is a good way to help you figure out what the dividing line is. Now, where is the outsourced process performed? And there's a couple of things that they suggest. It could be done within the physical premises or work environment of your organization. We'll look at an example. It could happen at an independent site, and they say in some other manner, but quite frankly, I've never been able to figure out another thing that isn't one of these two. It either happens at your location or it happens outside your location at an independent site. Now here's an example. So we're going to work through some examples that are going to illustrate some of the aspects of these outsourced processes. So you contract with a call center. It's run by another company. They provide the facility, they manage their employees, and they train them to your specifications. Okay, so you've got a call center process, and you have decided to outsource it. So this is an outsourced process. This is a supplier that's totally independent, and the work is performed at an independent site. Right? So the call center is set up by some other company who has the expertise in call centers. You're contracting with them to provide call center services to you. You need that as part of your quality management system, so that is going to be an outsourced process for you. Now, here's a cleaning company example. You contract for a cleaning company. It's run by another company, right? So the cleaning service comes in, and they do cleaning at your facility, right? But they manage their own employees. They train them to their own specifications, and they provide the necessary cleaning supplies. And that's what it means to be totally independent. So the supplier of the cleaning service is totally independent of your organization, but the work they do is performed at your physical premises, right? It's hard to have a cleaning company that never comes into your company. So they're an independent organization, but they're going to come into your organization to provide the service that they're offering you. Now here's another example. You're a small division, but you're close to a larger division of the same parent company. This larger division has an internal calibration lab. Because they've got capacity, you're going to send your inspection, measuring, and test equipment to them for calibration. They're going to provide the facility, they're going to manage the employees, and they're going to send you the appropriate calibration certificates. So the idea here is that you've got an outsourced process, calibration of inspection, measuring, and test equipment. It's outside to you, but it's happening in a sister division in the same large company. That means all the costs and revenue stay inside your own company. So this is an outsourced process. The supplier is part of the same parent organization, but the work is performed at an independent site. Our last example is corporate compliance audits. Now, this often happens in large companies in particular. Your division is part of a large parent company. After some lawsuits, the law department in your parent company said they're going to establish their compliance program, and it's going to cover a large number of areas like labor laws, OSHA, EPA, and in our case, ISO 9001 quality management systems. Right? So the corporate law department is going to come in, and they're going to do some audits. And these corporate procedures require you to include these law department audit results in your management review as if they were your own internal quality audits. So what's happening is, in essence, a corporate auditor is coming in and performing an audit which you count as an internal quality audit. Right? So this is an outsourced process. The supplier is part of the same parent organization, and the work is done at the physical premises of your organization. They have to come into your company in order to do their audits, but they count as part of your quality management system. So this is the 4 cases that we've looked at. So on the supplier side, you could have the same parent or totally independent parent. Totally independent company. at the work location, it could happen at your site, or it could happen at an independent site. So there are basically 4 possibilities for the way this thing is structured, and I've given you an example of each one. And so this diagram shows the 4 cases in the examples that we've used. Now, here's some things for you to think about, because the idea here is that you're going to make sure that you've got all of this managed appropriately inside your company. So think about these 4 cases that we've looked at. And for every one of these processes, particularly the outsourced processes, you need to address a couple of things. So the first one is the supplier inside the scope of your quality management system. So notice in all these 4 cases, the supplier was not inside your quality management system. And let's look at the law department example. You're not doing audits of the law department. They're not inside your quality management system. They're doing audits of your organization that you count as internal quality audits. So that's their independence. So they, as a supplier, are not inside the scope of your quality management system. Now, do you expect a purchase order, contract, or quality agreement? Now, if it's the cleaning company or the call center, yeah, you probably have a purchase order and a contract, and you're going to have some kind of quality agreement that's going to define the services and the scope. You know, how often does the cleaning crew come in? What happens at the call center when they run into various kinds of issues, or what are the training requirements, and so on and so on. So you're going to define all of that. Maybe not so much with the law department example or the inspection, measuring, and test equipment example. Now, do you expect the relationship to be controlled by the purchasing methods in Clause 7.4? Well, the guidance document says yes, and ISO 9001 suggests that the answer is yes. Now, what this means is that you may or may not necessarily have all of the formal mechanisms of supplier selection. As an example, with the inspection, measuring, and test equipment case, you probably don't have an option to pick another supplier. And so you need to make sure that that sister division is operating correctly, but it isn't like you probably had an opportunity to choose them. You probably got an edict from corporate that said, we want to keep these costs inside the company, and so consequently you'll use the sister division. The last thing to think about is there a monetary transaction involved? How do you pay for it? Now, with the law department case, you're probably not paying for it in any direct sense. It's probably in some kind of overhead. With the inspection, measuring, and test equipment example, you may be paying by the piece that gets calibrated, but it's probably an intercompany transfer. There's probably not a purchase order and then an invoice and accounts payable, and all of that stuff happens as if they were outside of your parent company. The way the monetary transactions happen are not relevant to whether or not it's an outsourced process. So it's not a question of whether you're writing a purchase order and paying through accounts payable. That's irrelevant in making this decision. The decision is an outsourced process, is an external organization, and that's why the rule of thumb is so important. So you need to think about these 4 cases as examples of what might be happening in your company. Now, the guidance document tells us that in some cases, the organization might not purchase the outsourced processes in the traditional sense. And this is what we've just talked about. You might, for example, receive the service from a head office or another division of the company without any monetary transaction taking place. Now, obviously there is going to be some monetary transaction, but it's probably going to not be the traditional purchase order, invoice, accounts payable. It's probably going to happen at some corporate allocation up at the top level that the accountants are going to deal with. So it may not look like there's a specific monetary transaction taking place. The guidance document says it doesn't make any difference. Clauses 7.4 and 4.1, that is purchasing and outsourced processes, still apply. So the question is not how you pay for it, whether or not you write a purchase order. The question is, are you getting a service required for your quality management system that's outside of your quality management system? It's being performed outside. Now, why would we ever do this? Well, here's a couple of situations. The organization has the competence and the ability to carry out the process, but chooses to outsource it. Maybe what they want to do is focus on their core competency. If their core competency is not cleaning, then maybe they're going to go hire somebody that does cleaning. They could have an internal cleaning crew. Maybe the call center example is a case where, again, it's not their core competency. Now, if they want to outsource a process they've already done, the process control criteria is already going to be defined, and so it's going to be pretty easy to transfer it as an outsourced process if necessary. So that's going to be a relatively straightforward way in which you're taking an internal process and you're making it an outsourced process, but you already understand the process because you've been performing it for some time. Now, here's another situation. The organization doesn't have the competency to do the process itself and chooses to outsource it. Now, there you've got to be very careful about the controls, and we often see this in terms of validated processes. So, a service, for example, if you are making a medical device that requires sterilization, you may not have the competency to perform the sterilization, and so you have an outsourced process, sterilization. And so you need to make sure that you have adequate controls over that, and that's going to be a process that's going to require process validation. So you need to think about those kinds of things if you're in this situation where you don't have the competency to perform the process. Now you've got a real problem about defining the type and extent of controls to make sure that they're adequate. Now, we've raised this issue of process validation, and so we're going to need to look at it again. It might not be possible to verify the output from the outsourced process by subsequent measuring and test. And the classic case is where the monitoring and measuring method is destructive. And that's what we see in the sterilization case, for example. In order to know whether the contents of the package were sterilized properly, you'd have to open up the package and do the test, and that destroys the sterility. So it's basically a destructive test. That's usually what happens. And so ISO 9001 has a clause dealing with validated processes. So it could very well be that the process that you're outsourcing also requires process validation. So that's going to be part of your control mechanism. All right, so now we're going to turn our attention to purchasing. Here is the model in ISO 9001 about how purchasing is set up. So we're going to flow through some stuff. We're going to establish the criteria for the supplier. We're going to evaluate potential suppliers. We're going to select the supplier that's going to do the work. We're going to define the controls. This is the type and extent of control over the supplier. We're going to create records that demonstrate all of the work that we've done. And then we're going to go into some kind of monitoring phase in which we're going to look at how the supplier is actually operating. So we're going to go through these and look at what the requirements are and discuss some of the issues here. So the first requirement is that you as an organization ensure that purchased product conforms to specified requirements. And remember, product in this case is this broad definition. It's the output of a process, and we saw 4 kinds of products. They could be services, they could be software, they could be hardware, they could be process material. So sometimes we see people make a distinction between product and services. In this case, product includes services because that's the way the ISO 9000 definition is built. So you're going to have specified purchase requirements, right? So that's going to be what the supplier is supposed to be providing, and you have to have some method to verify conformity. So in this case, you're purchasing a process from a second party that is somebody outside the scope of your quality management system. So you've got to define all of these things in terms of the outsourced process. Now, then you're going to establish the criteria to select, evaluate, and reevaluate these suppliers when they're established. So And these criteria are going to be very important. But in some cases, you may not have a choice. The corporate policy may tell you, for example, that you've got to use the sister division. The corporate policy may tell you that corporate organization is going to perform something. So you may not have choice in terms of selection and so on, but that still doesn't absolve you from the methods to develop the evaluation and reevaluation, and that's what we're going to talk about. So you're expecting this outsourced process to perform correctly, and so the question is, how are you going to make sure that you know what that means and that you've got a method to evaluate it? Now, then you're going to select suppliers based upon their ability to meet the organization's requirements. Again, in some cases, you don't have a choice. So you set up the selection criteria in an earlier case. Then you're going to measure potential suppliers against that criteria, and you're going to look for gaps. And it could very well be that there's no one supplier that satisfies everything that you're looking for. So you might have to make a trade-off about what characteristics are most important to you. Now, you're going to define the type and extent of control that you're going to apply to the supplier and to the product that you get from them. And the type and extent of control is really going to depend upon what effect this has on your product. So it's very important here that you evaluate this relatively early. And we talked about that. It's a sort of risk-based approach. The type and extent of control is going to depend on how, on what impact the outsource process could have on your final product. So there's a good chance that the cleaning crew that's cleaning the office, if they make a mistake, it's probably not going to impact your final product. On the other hand, the calibration lab, if they're making a mistake in calibrating test equipment, that could have a major impact on your ability to identify and separate conforming from non-conforming product. So you've got to understand that. And so we're going to talk about this idea about where these controls come from. And we're going to talk about a base control plan and an additional control plan. In essence, as you're developing the requirements for the outsourced process, it's pretty easy to think about how you're going to control it without necessarily understanding what the supplier's capabilities are. Then when you finally understand some things about the supplier and the supplier's capabilities, you may need to add additional elements into your control plan. So I'm suggesting that very often as you plan this, you'll have a base control plan, the things that you're going to do for every supplier, and you'll have additional control plan elements based upon your supplier evaluation in any gaps that you find. Now you're going to keep records. All right, so this is going to be the objective evidence that you followed the requirements. And so you're going to understand what you did to evaluate these suppliers and how all of this is going to work. And you're going to record all of this to demonstrate with objective evidence to your whoever's going to come in and audit you that you're actually following the process that you've established. Now, you're also going to set up criteria for selection, evaluation, and reevaluation in this case. And so we're looking now at outsourced processes. So in essence, what I'm going to talk about is the supplier scorecard. And the requirement is from 4.1.E, which tells us that you as the organization have to monitor, measure, and analyze processes that are part of your quality management system. And so that means that you've got to monitor, measure, and analyze the outsourced processes because they're part of your quality management system. Now, the next thing we're going to look at is purchasing information. This is basically how you're going to define what the supplier is going to provide. So the purchasing information is going to describe the product that you're going to purchase. So requirements to approve product, requirements to approve procedures, processes, equipment, whatever is involved, and this is particularly important if the supplier is producing a validated process, producing product from a validated process. That might include qualification of personnel. Now, if you are working with a calibration laboratory, then you probably want somebody in the calibration laboratory that understands the requirements for metrology. So that would be very important. Quality management system. So maybe you are telling the outsourced supplier that they've got to have an ISO 9001 quality management system. If you are doing a cleaning company, probably not so much. If you're doing a company that's doing inspection, measuring, and test equipment, ISO 9001 may not be appropriate because there are standards for calibration labs. So you're going to figure out which ones are appropriate, if any, for the supplier that's going to perform this outsourced process. And their ability to meet these things are going to be one of the questions that you're going to ask in the evaluation, and their continuing ability to meet them are going to be some of the things you could potentially look at in reevaluation. Now, you're going to define all of this in the purchasing data, and the requirement is that it needs to be adequate. And so somehow you're going to figure out adequacy. Now, the easiest way to do it, in my opinion, is through document control. So you want to have your purchasing data, that is what you're telling the supplier they have to perform. The best approach, in my view, is to put it under document control. That takes it through the review and approval cycles, and the review and approval cycles are where you're going to get the adequacy determination. And then you're going to assign revision levels and document numbers and all of that sort of stuff, and that's going to give you the appropriate level of control so that you and the supplier know how to identify the document. So my recommendation is that you satisfy this by utilizing the document control system, and that is actually extending to everything, even places where it's not an outsourced process. So this is the structure that we've looked at. On the left-hand side, we've got a set of requirements, and there are requirements on the product and requirements on the supplier. And you're going to identify them and put them into a base control plan. This is going to define the type and extent using the knowledge that you have of what the outsourced process is supposed to deliver to you. And then on the right-hand side, you're going to evaluate potential suppliers for their ability to produce the product and their capabilities to satisfy your quality management system requirements, for example. You're going to find gaps, and you're going to have some way to close those gaps or prevent them from causing you problems. Those are going to be in an element that I'm going to call the additional control plan. That's going to be a supplier agreement and additional activities. And then you're going to put them together, right? So you're going to then write a final control plan, and this is going to be the way that you are going to define the type and extent of control that you're going to have over the supplier. And you need to tell the supplier what it is. I mean, this should not be a secret. The last thing you want is the supplier to become surprised because you're expecting them to do something and you haven't told them what your expectations are. So this is going to be the overall structure. This is the final control plan, and it's going to come out of this standard purchasing process. All right, so now we've identified the process that we're going to outsource. We know its requirements. We understand something about the supplier. We've looked at the gaps. We've put the control plans in place, type and extent of control, and now we need to monitor and measure this process performance. Because remember, this process is an outsourced process, but essential to our quality management system. So this is going to fall under monitoring and measuring. And so here's the requirement. It's in 8.2.3. Apply suitable methods for monitoring and measurement of the quality management system processes. Right? So this is going to extend to outsourced processes as well. So measurement process is a set of operations to determine the value of a quantity. That comes out of ISO 9000. monitoring is not defined in the standards, but actually monitoring and measuring are defined in that other guidance document. They're common terms, and they show up in that common terms document. So how are we going to do monitoring and measuring of our outsourced processes? Well, because we've got this outsourced process under purchasing control, supplier scorecard is an appropriate mechanism. All right, so what are we going to do? 8.2.3 tells us these methods for monitoring and measuring have to demonstrate the ability of the process to achieve planned results. So we know what that is. For every outsourced process, we've identified what it is it's supposed to achieve. That's going to be part of our control plan. So as an example, you might say for inspection, measuring, and test equipment that everything is identified in terms of its ability to meet requirements, both as received by the Cal Lab and after all of the calibration is done, and that all of the certificates demonstrate traceability to the National Institutes of Standards and Technology, as an example. In the call center case, maybe it's some criteria about how long it takes before the call is answered, the number of times that the issue is resolved on the first call, so on. There is a whole set of call center metrics. That's what we're after, right? So this is going to be monitoring and measuring to demonstrate the ability of the process to achieve planned results. The implication here is that we've got all of these things planned, and we know how to monitor and measure them. When planned results are not achieved, correction and corrective action is taken as appropriate. So the correction is the action to eliminate a detected nonconformity. Corrective action eliminates the cause of the detected nonconformity. Now, I mentioned earlier, people get very confused about correction, corrective action, and preventive action, so you need to read ISO 9000 to get the proper definitions and get them well understood. But the idea here is that we're going to monitor and measure processes to make sure they achieve their planned results. And when they demonstrate the planned results are not being achieved, we're going to take some kind of action. Correction to eliminate the problem, corrective action to eliminate the cause of the problem. Now, this is our picture of what's going on. I've got all of these quality management system processes in the rectangle on the left. And I've shown a little segregation of an outsourced process, or the set of outsourced processes. And that's where we're going to have control through the purchasing organization and monitoring and measuring through the purchasing organization. Now, we're going to have the same aspects for the internal QMS processes as well, but they're particularly important with the outsourced processes. So the method that we're going to use that I recommend is the supplier scorecard. And so there's a couple of things that you need to think about. How often are you going to prepare the supplier scorecard? Its frequency. And what kind of information are you going to include? And it could be both quantitative and qualitative information, and we'll give some examples. So if you have the competency and the ability to carry out the process, you choose to outsource it, you probably already have the monitoring and measuring systems established, so you just transfer them to the outsourced process, right? Because you were doing it before and you were monitoring it when it was an internal process. If you don't have the competency to carry out the process and you choose to outsource it, then you need to sit down with the supplier, because they're going to understand this process. That's why you picked them to begin with. So they should help you determine the scorecard contents. And it's going to be very important to them that the scorecard monitor and measure the right things, because it's going to be what's valuable to them to meet your requirements. Now, how often are we going to do this? Now, the frequency depends upon a number of factors. How important is the process? Right, so if it's a very important process, I want to do the monitoring and measuring fairly often. How often does the information change? If it's a pretty stable process and it doesn't change very often, inspection, measuring, and test equipment calibration, pretty stable. You know, we always get the certificates. They're always traceable to NIST. You know, that date is not going to change very often. In the call center case, we might see a lot of variability from day to day as staffing levels change, skill levels change, kinds of calls change, and so on. And then one of the questions is, how difficult is it to collect the information? If it's really difficult to get our hands on it, we don't want to measure it very often because of the difficulty. Now, how often do we do this? My recommendation is that you time it in terms of your management review, at least as often as your management review. So if you're doing management reviews 2 times a year, then you want to do the supplier scorecards 2 times a year. If it's a critical process that is very important to you, then maybe you want to do the scorecard once a quarter, or maybe even once a month. That's what you've got to settle on. But my recommendation is that you bring all of these scorecards to management review, which means that you've got to do them at least as often as you do management review. Now, many companies do management review 2 times a year. Sometimes they do it only 1 time a year. But whatever that frequency is, that is the lower level of how often you're going to do supplier scorecards. All right, now what kind of information you're going to put on them? Well, for quantitative information, I've assumed that we are delivering a product or a service. And so one of the things that we might be interested in is it showing up on time? Now, if this is the calibration lab case, then you're shipping the test equipment to them, they're doing the work, and they're shipping it back to you. So you've got a pretty solid receipt on the dock date. If it is the call center example, you know, maybe not so much. You're not going to receive that service at your dock, and so you need to have some kind of different metric about how often this service is being delivered to the callers on time. How often is it acceptable, right? So if you're having a product manufactured for you and it's on the dock and you can inspect it in some way, then you can develop an acceptance rate. What about cost? And you need to think not just in terms of the cost on the purchase order, if there even is a purchase order, but what is the cost of ownership? What does it cost you, if it's a physical product, for example, to get it into your stockroom? For qualitative information, it could be a lot more subjective. So you're the customer, so you might have the stakeholders involved in this process asking questions like, am I happy? Is this supplier easy to work with? Are they generating a lot of problems that I have to resolve that we wish they weren't generating at all? So how am I satisfied as a customer? So that's going to be kind of fuzzy qualitative information. Another thing that sometimes people worry about is social responsibility. So is my supplier implementing good management practices for employees? Is my supplier being conscious of energy consumption and switching away from incandescent bulbs or whatever, right? So if you've got some supplier response, some social responsibility concerns, oftentimes that's going to be qualitative information as opposed to quantitative information. So you're going to figure out what's going to go on the scorecard. Now, I'm going to give you some examples. On-time delivery, for example, the number of received on time divided by the number of received, and this could be lots. Sometimes we want to show it as aging as well. So if things are late, how many were 1 to 5 days late, how many were 6 to 10 days late, and so on. If we're doing some kind of acceptance activity, what is the acceptance rate? The number of lots accepted divided by the number of lots received. And if we're doing costs, maybe it's landed costs. What does it cost to get it into the stockroom, right? So, for example, if the acceptance rate is low and we reject a lot of stuff, then the cost per unit to get one into the stockroom is going to go up because I've got to handle the nonconformances, disposition it, return to the supplier, and so on. You want to capture all of those costs. That's the cost of owning the item from this supplier. Now, qualitative information, that's usually a little fuzzy. So we might survey the supplier customers and stakeholders of the outsourced process, right? So if I ship something to the outsourced process and they transform it and ship it back to me, ask the people who are shipping this stuff, how easy is it to deal with them? How easy is it to get back? Now, we might have a rating scale, plus, minus, and neutral, or maybe it's a more numerical scale, 1 to 5 or 1 to 10. So we would then want to produce some kind of diagram, right? A histogram of the results. How often does each one of these show up? Some kind of bar graph. That's very useful and helps the supplier interpret what the information is. And turning things into pictures is very valuable. For social responsibility, maybe it's carbon emissions. So we're interested in their ability to reduce carbon emissions. How many programs do they have in place? Are they meeting our goals for social responsibility? Maybe we care about the gender ratios of employees. We want to make sure that they've got appropriate ratios, that people are being promoted regardless of gender. And this is usually important when we're doing comparative analysis across multiple suppliers. Does one stand out as particularly good? Does one stand out as particularly bad? And so that's usually what shows up in the social responsibility. All right, so we're going to turn to summary and conclusions. The idea here is that your quality management system is composed of a whole set of processes that interact. And this is the big change that happened in the 2008 version of the standard. So you're going to now define everything in terms of processes. You're going to define all of the processes in your quality management system. You're going to define their interactions, inputs, outputs. You're going to define the monitoring and measurement methodologies that you're going to use. And then you're going to ask the question, which processes am I going to do internally and which ones am I going to outsource? I could do it for one of two reasons. I have the capability, but I choose to outsource it for a variety of reasons, or I don't have the capability and I want to send it to somebody that can do it. And the somebody could be part of your same parent organization, a sister division, or it could be somebody outside of your parent company as well. So that's an external supplier. So you're going to make all of these decisions and you're going to document them. Now, the level of control over outsourced processes starts to show up in these notes in the 2008 version of the standard. So this is where we require control over outsourced processes, and the standard says, recommends that you should do this through supplier management. You've already got all the supplier management mechanisms set up, so just use it. So you're going to establish requirements for the outsourced processes. You're going to develop controls, the type and extent, depending upon some factors that we've talked about. Then you're going to evaluate potential suppliers and select one or more. In the modern world, it's typically only one. And then you're going to monitor and measure those processes, and typically that's going to be some kind of supplier scorecard. Now, the conclusion then is that ISO 9001-2008 didn't have a whole lot of new requirements, but it did address this sort of little hole they had about outsourced processes. And the standard says the right way to do outsourced process control is to utilize the purchasing process. And that's what I recommend. It's all set up, all ready to go. For other reasons, utilize it. And then supply chain management is then going to have an important role in managing these external processes that are necessary for your quality management system. All right, so I'm going to open it up for questions. So I'm going to turn it back to our host, who will tell you how to ask questions.
Thank you, Dan, for the wonderful presentation, and I would also like to thank all participants for cooperating with us. Now, as Dan mentioned, it's time for the Q&A to begin. As I told you earlier, 10 minutes of your time will be allotted. So I request all who have questions for our presenter to click on the raise hand option, which is a palm-like icon at the bottom of your participants panel. Now, this is to ask your questions verbally, or you can also post your questions in the Q&A panel so that our presenter can read it out loud and then answer it for you. Now, if for any reason you're unable to ask your questions using either of two means that I just mentioned, please share it with me by chat, and I shall pass it on to our presenter to answer it for you. Okay, now ladies and gentlemen, meanwhile, as we're waiting for the questions to come up, we sincerely request you to share your feedback in the feedback form that will appear on your polling panel right now. As you can see, this feedback is just 8 questions, mostly multiple choice in nature, and it would not take more than 2 minutes of your time to answer that. Now, this polling would remain open till the end of the session, so you can answer it even after the Q&A is over. Also like to inform you now, if in case you come up with any questions even after today's session, you can go ahead and send in your questions to me, or you can so that I can go ahead and pass on your questions to our presenter and get that answered for you. Okay, and this is the upcoming webinar of Dan. So if you feel that this topic will be relevant to you or any of your colleagues, you can always log into our website, which is www.globalcompliancepanel.com, and get enrolled to the session. Ladies and gentlemen, if you do have any questions from today's session, the Q&A session has begun. So I request you to put forward your questions to our presenter. I'd also like to inform all participants that if in case you feel that your team members, colleagues might benefit from this webinar, I'm happy to inform you that it will be available in the recorded format, and you can purchase it from our website. Or you can call in us and we can get the access information for the recorded version of this webinar. And these are some of the past webinars that Dan conducted. These are all available in the recorded format, and you can purchase it from our website or you can give us a call. Okay, Dan, I don't see any question that's coming up from our participants. Let's give it about another minute, and if there is no question that's coming up, we will then go ahead and conclude the session for today.
Okay, sounds good to me.
Thank you, Dan. As I informed you earlier, now if in case you come up with any questions after today's session, please do not hesitate to send in your questions to me, and I can go ahead and forward your questions to our presenter, and he will get that answered for you. And I also like to inform you that we welcome your suggestions and feedbacks or ideas on how we can improve our webinar. Now, if you would like to suggest a topic or desire a customized corporate training online or on-site, we ensure that whatever is your training necessity, it will be a priority. Now, if you do have more questions or any queries, you could always send in your queries to webinars@globalcompliancepanel.com, or you can call in your toll-free number. Okay, Dan, I do see that there is one question that's coming up from one of the participants. I will go ahead and unmute the line so that they can ask the question verbally to you, okay?
Okay.
Thank you. Fred?
Yes.
Fred, go ahead with your question.
Is there a difference between just purchasing a component and the definition of an outsourced process, or what's an outsourced process?
When all is said and done, they're really going to be the same. Now, components tend to be. Are you in medical devices?
Yes.
Okay. So the word component means something special in medical devices, but generally it's a piece of hardware, and you've got some supplier that's manufacturing something from you, and they're going to send it in, and so your supplier controls are going to be very much that we saw in the purchasing world, and you're going to receive a product, a physical thing, the component. Outsourced processes, sometimes they do that. So sterilization is an outsourced process in which you send them something and you get it back. But sometimes the process is only going to produce a service, and it doesn't actually arrive on your doorstep. But the same purchasing methodology, the same purchasing strategy is going to apply in both cases. It's just that if it doesn't show up on your doorstep, like the call center, then you're going to have a very hard time doing acceptance activities. But beyond that, it's essentially the same when all is said and done.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, now just to inform you again, the feedback form will be available till the end of the session. So I kindly request you to share in your feedback before you guys could log off today's session. Okay. Now here is our toll-free number and where you can get in touch with us. So as I mentioned you earlier, if you do have any queries at all in future, you can always send in your emails or you can call in the number that is on your screen right now. Okay, Dan, before we could conclude today's session, do you have any final thoughts?
Yes, I just want to, as I said in the question to Fred, the purchasing application here is very similar to anything else that you would run through purchasing. What's really different here is that very often you're purchasing a service as the process rather than a part as the output of the process. And so identifying, monitoring them, and covering that in management review is where oftentimes the difference shows up, because now you have a process that's part of your quality management system as opposed to getting a physical component that may be being manufactured by somebody else. So there is a major distinction here. A lot of the things are similar to what we've talked about, and as we've said in the process, where the process is delivering a service, it may be very different.
Thank you, Dan. And ladies and gentlemen, just to inform you again, if you do come up with any questions after today's session, do send in your questions to me, and I will go ahead and get that answered from Dan. And we look forward to having you with us again sometime soon. And on behalf of our presenter, Dan O'Leary, and the Global Compliance Panel team, I'd like to thank you all for participating in this webinar, and I wish you a pleasant day ahead. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, and Dan, thanks a lot for your time today. You have a wonderful day ahead.
Thank you, and thank you all.
Thank you. Bye-bye.